The microphone slipped from Simon Cowell's hand. In 20 years of judging, through thousands of auditions, he had never asked this question. The studio fell silent as 12-year-old Danny Martinez stood on the America's Got Talent stage, clutching a worn photograph in his trembling hand. What happened next would shatter every rule about television, about talent shows, and about what it means to truly listen to someone's story. But to understand why Simon Cowell broke his own protocol that Tuesday evening in Los Angeles, we need to go back to what Danny whispered during rehearsal. 3 words that changed everything. The Dolby Theater buzzed with its usual pre-show energy. Contestants paced nervously backstage. Producers checked lighting cues. The audience filled their seats, phones ready to capture the next viral moment. And sitting in the judges' chairs, Simon adjusted his signature black t-shirt, ready for another night of dreams and disappointments. Danny Martinez was contestant number 847 that season. At 12 years old, he barely reached the microphone stand. His oversized dress shirt was borrowed from the costume department after they realized his own clothes wouldn't work for television. In his pocket, carefully folded, was a photograph so worn the edges had turned white from years of handling. During sound check, Danny had been quiet, polite. Yes, sir, no, sir, to every question. The production team assumed he was just nervous. What they didn't know was that Danny had been rehearsing this moment not for weeks, but for 7 years. Ever since the night everything changed. Danny, you're up in 5 minutes, the stage manager announced, adjusting his headset. The boy nodded and walked to the side stage area. That's when Sophia, the assistant producer, noticed him talking to himself. Not rehearsing lyrics, talking, as if someone was standing right next to him. She moved closer and heard him whisper, "Don't worry, he's gonna like it. Simon looks tough, but Mrs. Patterson at the group home says tough people usually have the biggest hearts." Sophia assumed he was calling someone, but Danny's hands were empty. No phone, no earpiece. He was talking to the air beside him. When she asked who he was speaking to, Danny's answer stopped her cold. "My parents. They're always with me during performances." The cameras rolled. Terry Crews announced Danny's name with his characteristic enthusiasm, and a 12-year-old boy who had been in foster care for 7 years walked onto the most famous stage in America, carrying more than just his dreams. "Hello, Danny," Simon said, leaning forward slightly. His voice carried that familiar mix of authority and curiosity. "Tell us about yourself." Danny stepped closer to the microphone. Under the hot stage lights, his dark hair caught the golden glow. His brown eyes, too mature for his age, scanned the audience. He was looking for something or someone. "My name is Danny Martinez. I'm 12 years old and I live in Los Angeles." His voice was steady but small, the kind of voice that had learned not to take up too much space. "And what will you be performing for us tonight?" Heidi asked with her warm smile. "I'm going to sing a song I wrote. It's called Saving Seats." Danny's hand moved instinctively to his pocket, touching the photograph through the fabric. Simon's eyebrows raised slightly. Original songs from 12-year-olds were rare. Usually kids stuck to Disney covers or pop hits. "You wrote this yourself?" "Yes, sir. I write a lot of songs, but this one is special." "What's it about?" Howie called out. Danny paused. This was the moment he had rehearsed 1,000 times. In foster homes, in group showers, in the back seats of social worker cars. But standing here with 4 judges and millions of viewers waiting, the words felt heavier than ever. It's about saving seats for people who can't come to see you perform. The judges exchanged glances. There was something in Danny's tone, a weight that suggested this wasn't just a creative choice. This was personal. "That's a beautiful concept," Sophia said gently. "Are your family members here tonight to support you?" And there it was, the question Danny had been preparing for, the question that would change everything. Danny's hand moved to his pocket and pulled out the worn photograph. Even from the judges' table, they could see how carefully he handled it, like it was made of glass. "This is my family," he said, holding up the photo. "My mom, Maria, and my dad, Carlos. They died in a car accident when I was 5. The audience intake of breath was audible. On the judges' panel, Sophia's hand moved to her heart. Howie's usual smile faded. Heidi leaned forward with concern. And Simon went completely still. I've been in foster care for 7 years, Danny continued, his voice growing stronger. I've lived in, let me count, 8 different homes, but whenever there's a talent show or a school concert, I always ask them to save 2 seats in the front row for my parents. The silence in the Dolby Theater was profound. 3,000 audience members held their breath. Camera operators, usually focused on getting the perfect shot, found themselves wiping their eyes. But Danny wasn't finished. The thing is, Mr. Simon, most of the foster families I've lived with, they think it's weird, saving seats for people who aren't coming, but my parents are coming. They're here right now. They're always here when I perform. Simon Cowell, the man famous for his sharp critiques and unfiltered honesty, found himself speechless. In 20 years of judging, he had heard sob stories, manipulation tactics, and genuine heartbreak. But something about Danny's matter-of-fact delivery, his absolute conviction, cut through every defense Simon had built around his heart. Danny, Simon said, his voice softer than usual, how do you know they're here? The boy smiled for the first time since walking on stage. Because when I sing, I can feel them listening, and when I finish, I can feel them clapping, even if nobody else is. Behind the scenes, producers were frantically signaling cameras to capture every angle. They knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't just television. This was a child bearing his soul to the world. The music began, a simple piano melody that Danny had hummed in countless foster bedrooms, refined over years of secret practice. His voice, clear and pure, filled the massive theater. I save you a seat wherever I go, front row center, so you'll know that even though you can't be seen, you're still the most important thing to me. By the second verse, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience, but something else was happening. Simon, who typically remained impassive during performances, was leaning forward. His arms, usually crossed, hung at his sides. He was listening, not just with his ears, but with something deeper. Every school play, every talent night, I tell them, 2 seats please, front row, center right. They ask me who's coming. I say, my family. They say, but you're alone. I say, no, not really. When Danny reached the chorus again, his voice cracked slightly. Not from nerves, from emotion. He was seeing those empty seats he'd saved hundreds of times, foster parents who rolled their eyes, social workers who made excuses, audiences who felt sorry for the poor orphan boy. But tonight was different. Tonight, Simon Cowell was listening. The song built to its final verse, and Danny's voice grew stronger, more confident. So if you see me save 2 empty chairs, don't feel sad, don't say your prayers, 'cause love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes shape before your eyes. As the final notes faded, the silence stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Danny stood at the microphone, photograph still in his hand, waiting for judgment. Then something unprecedented happened. Simon Cowell stood up, not the dramatic standing ovation of a yes vote, not the performative gesture of a television moment. Simon stood up and walked around the judges' table toward the stage. The other judges watched in confusion. In 20 seasons of America's Got Talent, Simon had never left his chair during an audition. The audience murmured uncertainly. Producers whispered frantically into their headsets. Simon walked up the stage steps and approached Danny, who looked tiny under the massive stage lights. When Simon reached him, he knelt down, bringing himself to Danny's eye level. The cameras caught it all, but the microphones barely picked up what Simon said next. Danny, where do you usually sit when you save those seats? The boy looked puzzled. What do you mean, sir? When you save 2 seats for your parents, where do you sit? Oh. Danny's face brightened with understanding. I usually sit in the back, or off to the side, so they can have the best view. Simon's expression changed. Later, people would describe it as the moment when the judge became human, when the critic became a father figure, when the celebrity became just a man talking to a child who needed to be seen. Danny, Simon said, his voice thick with emotion, that millions of viewers would hear. I want to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. The boy nodded solemnly. Your parents aren't sitting in those empty seats you save. For a moment, Danny's face fell. The thing he had believed for 7 years, the comfort that had sustained him through countless lonely nights, seemed to crumble. But Simon wasn't finished. Your parents aren't in those seats because they're right here with you, on this stage, in your voice, in your courage, in the way you love them, even though they can't love you back the same way. Tears began streaming down Danny's face. I mean, you don't need to save them seats anymore, son, because they never left you. They're in every note you sing, every breath you take, every dream you chase. Simon paused, his own voice catching. And tonight, they're not watching from the audience. They're performing with you. The audience erupted. Not polite applause, but the kind of emotional release that comes when 3,000 people witness something sacred. Standing ovation doesn't adequately describe it. It was a collective recognition of humanity at its most pure. But Simon still wasn't done. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. Right there on stage, in front of millions of viewers, he made a call. This is Simon Cowell. I need you to connect me with the best child welfare attorney in Los Angeles tonight. Yes, I know what time it is. He hung up and looked directly into Danny's eyes. Danny, how long until you age out of the foster system? 30 days, sir. When I turn 13 next month, if nobody adopts me, I'll probably go to a group home until I'm 18. The judge's table erupted. Sophia gasped audibly. Howie shook his head in disbelief. Heidi had tears streaming down her face. Simon stood up, his hand on Danny's shoulder. Not anymore, he said, his voice carrying across the theater with absolute certainty. Because I'm going to make sure you have a family that understands what saving seats really means. The next few minutes were chaos, good chaos. The other judges rushed onto the stage. The audience was on their feet, many crying openly. Danny, overwhelmed, dropped the photograph he'd been clutching. Simon bent down and picked it up. He looked at it for a long moment, a young couple holding a 5-year-old boy with the same dark hair and bright eyes as the child standing before him. They were beautiful, Simon said simply, handing the photo back to Danny. And they raised an incredible son. Mr. Simon, Danny whispered, his voice barely audible over the audience. Does this mean I got 4 yeses? Simon laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from deep in the chest, from a place of joy and hope and possibility. Danny, this means you got something better than 4 yeses. This means you got a family. What happened next wasn't captured by the cameras because it happened too fast and felt too private for television. Simon pulled Danny into a hug, not the brief, camera-friendly embrace of a celebrity photo op, a real hug, the kind a father gives a son, the kind Danny hadn't felt since he was 5 years old. When they finally separated, Simon looked directly into the main camera. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight you witnessed something extraordinary. Not just a talented young performer, but a child who has spent 7 years loving people he can't see, honoring parents who can't respond, keeping faith when everyone else called it foolish. His voice grew stronger, more commanding. That's not just talent. That's character. That's the kind of person who changes the world. He turned back to Danny. So here's what's going to happen. You're going straight to the live shows, no more auditions, no more judges' cuts. Because tonight, you didn't just perform for us. You performed for everyone who has ever lost someone. Everyone who has ever saved a seat for someone who couldn't fill it. Everyone who has ever loved beyond sight. The applause that followed wasn't measured in decibels. It was measured in lives changed, in perspectives shifted, in hearts opened, but the story doesn't end there. 3 months later, the adoption papers were signed. Danny Martinez became Danny Cowell, son of Simon and Lauren Cowell. At the adoption ceremony, there were 4 chairs in the front row, 2 for Simon and Lauren, 2 empty ones with fresh flowers. For your first parents, Simon had whispered to Danny, because we're not replacing them. We're continuing their work. Danny's first performance in his new home wasn't on a stage. It was in Simon's living room. singing to those same two empty chairs he'd been saving for 7 years. But this time, Simon and Lauren sat beside them, creating not empty space, but full family. The song Saving Seats became a #1 hit, with all proceeds going to the foster care system. But more importantly, it started a movement. Theaters across America began reserving memory seats for audience members who wanted to honor lost loved ones. The Danny chairs became a symbol of love that transcends loss. Years later, when asked about that night on America's Got Talent, Simon would say, "I've judged thousands of performances, but Danny taught me the difference between performing and living, between entertaining and inspiring, between saving a seat and saving a soul." And Danny, he still saves seats. But now he knows that some seats aren't meant to be filled. They're meant to be honored, and some families aren't found through birth or blood, but through the simple act of recognizing love when it appears, even in the most unexpected places. Because sometimes the most powerful performance isn't about hitting the right notes. It's about loving the right people, even when they can't love you back the same way. And sometimes the best judges aren't the ones who critique your voice, but the ones who hear your heart. That night, on the America's Got Talent stage, a 12-year-old boy stopped saving seats for his parents and started saving space for hope. And in doing so, he saved everyone who was watching, including Simon Cowell. The photograph Danny carried that night sits framed in the Cowell family home. Next to it, a newer picture, Danny, Simon, and Lauren with two empty chairs beside them, because some traditions are too beautiful to break, and some love is too powerful to limit to the living. Share this story, because the world needs more people who save seats for love, and more people who understand that family isn't just about who's present, it's about who's present in your heart.